My name is Joe Milazzo. I'm with the Regional Transportation Alliance, voice of the business community on transportation, program of the Raleigh, North Carolina Chamber. We welcome both our North Carolina Section IT members and everyone throughout the Southern District for the last program block of the second day. This is technical session number 5. We will be done by 5 p.m. The title is, I said, show me the money, and it should be an exciting one. This is a complement to the session we heard earlier today, technical session number 3, which was fantastic. So if you have not had a chance to be a part of that, that has been recorded. You'll get a chance to watch that later. And so those who have seen it know exactly what I'm talking about. It was a fantastic session. And it talks about an important topic, which I'll briefly level set for you all right now. So transportation funding, transportation revenue, however you want to look at it, it's an important question for not just this profession, not just for this group, but really for the entire region and country. Because if we get transportation revenue right, if we get infrastructure right, then we get commerce right, and then we get prosperity. And so we're excited about the importance of that, but also focused on the urgency associated with that as well. And we have today, this afternoon session, a great conversation about exactly that. And we've got what I believe is a fantastic panel of folks that are going to talk to us from different perspectives on this. And so I'm going to go and introduce them all now. They're all on your screen. So first, I'm going to introduce Ms. Kelly Fuller. She is the president of the North Carolina Chamber Foundation. She leads the long-term policy development and strategic initiative activities to achieve the goals set in the North Carolina Chamber's North Carolina Vision 2030 program. She's an experienced public policy expert in a host of fields and a policy advisor, past policy advisor for 2 governors. She's also passionate about finding strategic solutions to complex problems, perfectly qualified for this one right here. And she enjoys building coalitions to facilitate change and achieving outcomes. And coalition building is also essential for transportation. So welcome, Kelly. We're also going to hear from Steve Bert. Steve is the team lead of ITRE, Institute for Transportation Research and Education, where I used to work, Economic Development, Economic and Policy Assessment Group, and the connection between economics, policy, and quality of life being a primary focus of his research. Some of the products from his research have justified sustained or increased spending for all modes of transportation in this state, and have also led to the implementation of transportation and health investments, not just here, but also in Delaware. In his former role as a transportation planner, he helped the city of Raleigh develop environmental justice strategies to enhance transit service equity among Go Raleigh's ridership. Please welcome Steve. Our next presenter is Ward Nye. Ward is the chairman of the board, the president, and the chief executive officer of Martin Marietta. It's a leading supplier of building materials, including aggregates, cement, ready-mix concrete, and asphalt. Many of us travel on his products directly or indirectly every day. He recently co-chaired the North Carolina First Commission, which was tasked with evaluating North Carolina's current and future transportation needs. He's also the chair of the NC Chamber, whose foundation, which Kelly leads, recently published a report on North Carolina's infrastructure and its funding. Ward received a bachelor's degree from Duke and a law degree from Wake Forest. Please welcome Ward. Emeline McCaleb is a data analyst at ITRE, works across groups, including the Highway Systems Group, Economic Policy Assessment Group, and the Bicycle and Pedestrian Group. Her main focus areas are survey research and data visualization. And as you're seeing, not just from her, but from all of our presenters, they are cross-functional and they deal with relationships and a variety of topics which are essential for success. So please welcome Emeline. Finally, Amna Cameron is the North Carolina Department of Transportation's Deputy Director of Strategic Initiatives and Program Support. She served as the lead staff to the North Carolina First Commission, which you heard about already just in the bios. So we've got a lot of wonderful folks who have worked together, and they're about to work for each of you over the next hour or so as we learn from each of them. So the way we're going to work today's session is we're going to begin with Kelly and Steve, and then we'll go through the process of that. Some of them have presentations, some have introductory remarks. All of them are going to be valuable for our understanding and perspective of an issue that seems intractable and yet is essential to get resolved. So let's begin by welcoming Kelly, and then the rest of us are going to turn our cameras off other than Steve. So the rest of us will turn our cameras off now.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you to our hosts at the Southern District of ITE. I am Kelly Fuller, President of the North Carolina Chamber Foundation, and pleased to preview the ITRE study about modernizing North Carolina's transportation funding model, which Steve Bert will explain in further detail. The foundation is the arm of the Chamber that focuses on critical issues facing our state, both currently and in the future, as we seek to ensure that North Carolina is the best place to live and work in the country. One of the most pressing issues I immediately recognized when I assumed this role in late 2019 was the way North Carolina funds transportation, which appeared to be both insufficient and based on outdated travel patterns and technology. A driving factor behind all of my work at the foundation is data. We don't want to develop policies and recommendations based on good ideas or
Unmuted. Unmuted.
Hey, Kelly. It looks like you've been muted.
Now, can you all hear me now?
Perfect.
Yep,
It
good to go.
keeps going off on me. So can you help me? Sorry, I keep going muted because I'm just sitting here and it just goes away. I'll keep talking and then just fuss at me if it starts again. How's that?
No, you're good to go. Just if you would, and I apologize, but I think that's my fault. Just go back and repeat just the last 30 seconds and you are good to go.
Sure. All right, guys. Sorry about that. I will not tell you all the ins and outs of the foundation and why data is all that important, which is why we contracted with ITRE, because they were going to do fabulous research in that space. But the two areas where we really wanted ITRE to focus had to do with looking at the economic impact of transportation investment and to research and recommend alternative funding models and approaches to ensure an adequate revenue stream. We had a sense that economic impact existed from the transportation investment based on a 2015 study that ITRE performed for the foundation. They found then that for every $1 billion invested in North Carolina's transportation network, it generated over 14,000 jobs, over $10 billion in wages, and almost $11 billion in gross state product. Those impacts were often realized after about 10 years post-project completion. What we were surprised to learn, however, with this study was the quick realization of such an impact, often within just 2 years after a project was completed. This study shows both the reality of such an impact and the relative quick time frame to realize such gains. The business community recognizes the critical role that a well-funded, well-maintained transportation system plays in its success. Without it, trucks cannot deliver goods in a timely fashion, product doesn't have a reasonable outlet for distribution, and communities cannot acquire or even retain good jobs. A solid transportation system is literally the foundation of economic development. One thing is really clear. We must reassess how we fund transportation and modernize that revenue collection model. Changing travel patterns and the impact of technology demand this change. Otherwise, North Carolina will continue to have woefully insufficient funds to maintain and build the system our state requires. We will fall further behind our competitor states in the economic development arena, and our citizens will suffer with often poor road conditions. The ITRE study highlights both the need and possible solutions. Thankfully, groups are using this study and the work of the NC First Commission, about which you'll hear shortly from Ward, to work with the General Assembly to modernize the way we fund transportation. With that in mind, I hand the mic to my colleague and friend, and hopefully you will hear him the whole time, at ITRE, Steve Bert. Steve's work, along with that of Daniel Finley and other experts at ITRE, made this report even more helpful and impactful than I ever could have imagined when we started over a year ago. Steve?
Unmute yourself. Shreyas, can you help us? It looks like he is muted.
Yes, not sure. Steve, I just sent you an
I think everybody can hear me now. Just as a note, Shreyas, I was receiving a message that I was muted by the organizer. So if perhaps for the next batch of speakers that come along. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. And can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And my name is Steve Bert. I'm the team lead for Economic and Policy Assessment Group at the Institute for Transportation Research and Education. And we're confronted today with a great banner question: are investments in roadways worthwhile? And before I dig into that answer, I'm going to emulate what seasoned researchers and politicians like to say, and that's "it depends." And hopefully by the end of this presentation, I can provide enough meaningful content to show that investments can be. So we've got a lot of information to cover during this presentation. We'll begin with a sample of highway investments around the country, getting a snapshot of some of the benefits and costs that highway investments generate. After that, we'll go over the full spectrum of economic impacts, benefits, and costs that may result from highway projects. And then I'd like to bring our focus back to North Carolina and share findings from the report that Kelly had mentioned, an analysis that we conducted which evaluated the economic impacts of highway investments throughout the state. And finally, as a recap, we'll go over what we learned today and revisit the question before us: are investments in roadways worthwhile? So we'll start our discussion today by taking a quick look at the Gordie Howe International Bridge, which is a 6-year, $5.7 billion project that's expected to have substantial economic impacts. Just to get started, in 2019, there were 350 engineers, architects, construction workers, and other workers who were employed to begin working on the bridge. And by project completion in 2024, they're expected to be 2,500 workers who will have been employed during the project period. And, you know, thinking about the project period, those are just a portion of the impacts that are associated with the Gordie Howe International Bridge. It's anticipated to save about 18.4 minutes for commuters who are making that border crossing between Detroit, Michigan and Windsor, Canada. And this ultimately relates to an annual economic benefit of approximately 1.1 to 2.3 billion in travel time savings for trucks. And then if you include cars in that figure, up to 3 billion in travel time savings. Another example, in Florida, there's the I-4 Ultimate project in Orange County, and it consists of reconstructing and widening 21 miles of Interstate 4 leading through Orlando. The project will implement numerous safety enhancements, which are estimated to reduce crashes by 13%. And overall, the project is expected to generate 1.8 billion in economic development benefits and create approximately 2,000 jobs. So the previous projects I mentioned were heavy on the economic impacts, economic benefits. I did want to bring to light an example of some of the negative externalities that highway projects can also produce and harm individuals living within the project area. So when evaluating a highway project, it's also important to account for the social costs. The Claiborne Expressway, for example, in Treme neighborhood in New Orleans, has captured national media attention of late, resulting from the magnitude of localized social costs that the expressway imposes on the community. The elevated expressway parallels the windows of many residents in the neighborhood, so when truck traffic goes by, it vibrates homes, it's loud, and the traffic generates air pollution in the community. And perhaps the most severe social cost of the project is neighborhood severance that originated when the project split Treme in the 1960s. So just kind of important to think about all the different types of project benefits and costs. And originally I wanted to show you all a video today, but I found that sharing the audio of that video was a little bit beyond the capabilities of GoToWebinar. So if you have an interest, don't take my word for it. There's a lot more granular detail related to the Gordie Howe International Bridge, the I-4 Ultimate Project, and the Claiborne Expressway, if you want to dig into some of the more of the economic benefits, costs, and economic impacts. So now I'd like to shift gears and provide you with a little bit more context revolving the whole suite of impacts, benefits, and costs that may result from a road project. Beginning with economic impacts, these are effects a highway project has on the economy of a designated area, and they can be measured in terms of change in jobs, earned income, business sales, value added. Also, some people know that as gross regional product or gross domestic product or tax revenue. And these effects are also sometimes referred to as economic development impacts. I just kind of want to get everybody aware of the nomenclature. And in addition to economic impacts, we have wider economic impacts, and these are associated with the amount of goods and services purchased or traded in the project area and result in the change in size of the economy. We witness economic impacts both during project development to support construction workers, engineers, architects, and after the project as businesses are able to reduce the cost of production, increase revenue, and bring on more employees. Getting into a little bit of what a wider economic impact is, these also affect the level of production in the economy, ultimately changing the amount of goods and services purchased or traded. And a highway project, for example, can reduce travel times, which may result in improvements in market access. This means workers and goods can travel farther in the same amount of time. This allows firms to select from a larger labor pool to improve production, and it also allows individuals to choose from a larger set of firms to improve their quality of life or improve their earned income. So in some instances, highway projects can lead to agglomeration effects, and that's when firms choose to relocate next to one another or next to population centers to reap the benefits of clustering. And just a quick example of that, you can think of a mall in which firms share building space and parking space. That's one example. And another would be when businesses just decide to cluster next together to better access workforce talent, reduce transportation supply chain costs, or be more closely located to inputs for production. And then in addition to our economic impacts, we have external benefits and costs, also known as externalities that result from highway investments. And externalities do not necessarily create an economic impact or a change in the size of the economy. However, they do result in a change in quality of life for the highway users and individuals within the project area by increasing consumer surplus or degrading consumer welfare. So now after getting an example of all the impacts and benefits and costs, there are a number of methods that we can use to analyze the efficacy or the value of roadway investments. Perhaps the most common method is analyzing the return on investment or similar types of economic efficiency. And this involves evaluating the economic return that is achieved from an investment. For example, a very conservative estimate from the Federal Reserve Bank demonstrates that for every $1 invested in highway infrastructure, that gives rise to $3 in economic output. Another common method to analyze highway investment is benefit cost analysis, called BCA for short. And a BCA estimates the anticipated benefits that are expected to accrue from a project over a specified period of time and compares them to the anticipated cost of the project. And the U.S. Department of Transportation requires benefit cost analyses to be conducted prior to awarding discretionary grants for infrastructure projects. And equity impacts are not yet widely appraised in the United States. However, methodologies for evaluating the distribution of costs, benefits, resulting from a highway project have been documented by transportation agencies overseas. And within the United States, there are plans in the next transportation authorization bill to include funding to sort of deal with the after effects of highway projects that have caused community severance or other externalities. So in this way, equity impacts are beginning to be considered alongside economic impacts and benefit cost analysis results. Well, so far you've received a quick and broad overview of the types of impacts, benefits, and costs, as well as the methods that can be used to evaluate road projects. Now I'd like to take a deeper dive into the economic impacts of highway investment in North Carolina. As part of a larger study effort for the North Carolina Chamber Foundation and a follow-up to a 2015 report, ITRE conducted an analysis that evaluated the economic importance of infrastructure investment in the state. And really the purpose of this analysis was to bring to light the economic impacts that result from highway investment, really constructed more closely to the present day. The oldest project we evaluated was after the year 2000. And at the time of the 2015 report release, the long-term viability of the motor fuels tax as a primary funding mechanism for transportation was being questioned not only across the United States, but also here within North Carolina. Vehicle fuel economy improvements coinciding with real purchasing power losses from the motor fuels tax. The federal motor fuels tax rate has actually not been adjusted for inflation since 1993. These were creating uncertainty about how the motor fuels tax could sustainably finance our transportation system needs. And as the state's leadership continues to evaluate the value of infrastructure investment, it has become an imperative for us to be able to quantify the economic importance of individual transportation projects. So for our economic analysis, we identified 4 case study projects dispersed throughout the state. This included evaluating the I-540 Viridia Parkway interchange, looking at the US 70 Goldsboro bypass, assessing the North Carolina 148 CF Harvey Parkway, and looking at NC 16 in Lincoln County. Case study projects were selected to study the economic impacts of transportation investment and to provide context about how these projects support the state's economy. And in addition to these 4 case studies, we conducted a geospatial analysis that evaluated all interstate, US highway, and North Carolina highways within the state's borders, comparing economic development characteristics between developed and non-developed roadways. So using the National Land Cover Database from the Multi-Resolution Land Characteristics Consortium, we analyzed the changes in land use between 2001 and 2016, with a buffer area of 3 miles surrounding the case study projects. Our case study findings demonstrated that the developed land within 3 miles of case study project areas experienced net land development changes of 1.8% to 12.5%, going from year 2001 to 2016. And in addition to our case study projects, we evaluated land development changes within 1 mile of all of North Carolina's interstate, US highways, and North Carolina highways during that same time frame from 2001 to 2016. We evaluated that land development growth occurred at greater intensities where projects occurred. So we saw this, for example, North Carolina highway projects led to an increase of 7.8 million square feet of development per mile of road, and that was more than 17 times the amount of development associated with unimproved North Carolina highway road segments. As part of the research, we studied the employment effects of our 4 transportation case studies to provide a better understanding of how these road projects, also how they support the North Carolina economy. And the number of business locations, and jobs within 3 miles of each project were studied. The results showed us that each road product, pardon me, the results showed us each road project was associated with positive increases in job growth. As an example, the area surrounding the Goldsboro bypass showed an increase in jobs of more than 11% from before the project was built to after the project was completed. And new roads create valuable real estate for commercial businesses, provide necessary infrastructure and connection for industry, and connect commuters with access to more distant employment centers, which can prompt residential development. All of these types of development create jobs, economic contributions, and tax revenues for the region where the road is located. Historical data demonstrates that for every $1 billion of transportation investment in North Carolina, that supports 14,300 jobs, 10.3 billion in wages, and 10.8 billion in gross state product. As an example from our research, this image shows the land use in 2001, followed by an image from 2016, which shows the connecting interchange between I-440 and I-87 along the I-87 corridor. The next image shows us the differences in business establishments between these two time periods. And this final image shows us a 1 mile buffer around the project, which is probably a conservative estimate of the impacts of this project. And comparing road segments with a project within the time period of 2001 to 2016, road segments without projects, those road projects experienced an additional planned development, firm creation, and job growth over the analysis period. So for example, locations within the North Carolina highway, locations within proximity to North Carolina road projects experienced 48% more business location growth than other North Carolina highways that were not improved. And additionally, locations within proximity to NC highway road projects experienced 16% more job growth than other NC highways that were not improved. Meanwhile, locations within proximity to interstate projects experienced 47% more job growth, and locations near US highways experienced 8% more job growth than their unimproved counterparts. So in summary, our analysis findings demonstrated significant economic impacts resulting from infrastructure investment. We observed a 76% increase in business growth for firms located within 1 mile of an interstate project, compared to 42% firm growth in locations by interstates that have not been improved. And additionally, we observed employment gains were about 16% higher in locations within proximity to an NC highway project than in locations proximate to a highway that was not improved. So taking us back to our initial question, are investments in road projects worthwhile? I've gotten a chance to share an example of US examples and our North Carolina case study findings that demonstrate road projects can generate substantial economic impacts. We also briefly discussed that there are important things to take into consideration when evaluating highway investments. And beyond economic impact, we can also weigh the benefits and costs of a project to assess if the benefits sufficiently exceed the costs. Furthermore, we can analyze equity impacts to see how economic benefits and costs are distributed. We saw evidence from New Orleans that projects can disproportionately burden individuals living in the project area and subject to road project externalities. Thus, as we continue to improve our data collection and analysis methods, it's important to evaluate economic impacts, benefit cost analysis ratios, and equity impacts to fully understand if a project is worthwhile. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to have your attention. That's all I have, and I'd be happy to address any questions if now is the appropriate time.
Steve and also Kelly, those were fantastic, both introductory remarks from her, setting the broad context for this, and then Steve, you diving into some of the why and also the how. It's not just an obvious question on this, so that was fantastic. What we're going to do, we're going to hold questions until the end. We're just going to keep moving along, but we're going to have that panel discussion towards the end. But that was very, very good. And Ward is up next. And I know Shreyas, you're going to be running his presentation. And let's make sure that Ward, that we can hear you. Let's go with that. Okay, and so cannot yet.
Okay.
So Shreyas,
Now you should be able to, can you?
we are good. Okay, and I
Very
think
good.
we're good to go. So Shreyas, you ready to advance him?
Yep.
Okay, I'll turn my camera off. Ward, have at it.
Joe, thanks so much. And Steve, Kelly, thank you both for your comments. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the NC First Commission. I'll give you a preview. I've got 15 slides, so it'll give you a sense of how long this will be, and I'll try to go through it at a pretty good clip here this afternoon. But I'll tell you, this was a fascinating undertaking that I was honored to be a part of. Nancy McFarland, the former mayor of Raleigh, and I co-chaired this commission. It was filled with more than a dozen participants from across North Carolina, all deeply engaged in the process. You'll hear later today from Amna Cameron, who, as you've already heard, was the staff liaison to the commission, and Amna did just superb work all the way through this. If you're wondering why we were pulled together, it's really several-fold. One, between now and 2030, we're going to add about 3 million people to North Carolina. That's effectively moving the entire state of Kansas into North Carolina in the next decade. Number one. Number two, we're not just trying to compete with our neighbors anymore. We're trying to compete globally and trying to make sure that North Carolina is in a position to succeed from every perspective, including competitive. We need to look at transportation and see how that works. And we're also focused on making sure that we have roads that are safe. And we'll talk a little bit more about what some of our roads look like, particularly in the rural part of the state as we go through this conversation. But if we can move on to the next slide, please. We began our conversations with this commission really taking a look at, number one, where we sit today relative to our road condition. And as we look at North Carolina's roads, here's the quick answer. We're mediocre. And one of the things that I think we all agreed on the commission is North Carolina has never been about mediocre. We were looking at numbers that could take us from mediocre to good, numbers that could take us from mediocre to something better than good. And as we looked at that, what we determined was minimally, we were needing an additional investment of at least $20 billion over the next decade to take North Carolina's roads from a condition of mediocre today to good. Number one, we didn't feel like in football parlance that we were out kicking our coverage with that. We thought that that was something that the state could do. But more importantly, we thought that for business and for the residents of North Carolina, that's something that the state very much needs to do and should do. So with that, let's go to the next slide, if we may. As I indicated before, I'm going to take you through a series of key findings. Part of what's important to remember is we did spend nearly 2 years studying this issue. So what we've done over a course of 2 years is we've spoken with national and international experts, and we went through a series of findings. Now, what's important for you to understand is the commission was made up of a host of people, as you would imagine, some left of center, some right of center, some very much in the center. And the one thing that we could all agree on is North Carolina needed to put significantly more money into its roads. What we thought we would do after that single recommendation is then provide the state with a series of options. And that's exactly what you see beginning on this slide. So what you'll see is we looked at several findings that we made. One, we saw a clear need for an increased level of investment. We talked about that. We think it needs to be at least 10 billion or 20 billion over the next decade. We also thought it was important to have a conversation that dictates that we have to move away from the gas tax. We heard just a few minutes ago from Steve talking about really what has not happened with the gas tax in over the last 25 plus years, at least from a federal perspective, and that is it hasn't changed notably, but we know cars are changing. We also know that we're going to have new revenue needs, both at the state and local areas, and that we know there's going to be considerably more need for education. Because as we see the way that roads are going to change, we're going to need to talk to our population about it. Here are a couple of things to keep in mind. Except for the state of Texas, North Carolina maintains more road miles than any other state in the United States. I'm sure that's something that most people in North Carolina don't know. The other thing that's worth remembering, and this is not a badge of honor for us, we're number 2 in the nation for fatalities on rural roads. So again, these are just part of the educational components that we think are going to be so important. Next slide, please. So as we started looking at options for consideration, we really broke it down into about 4 different categories. And the first one I'm going to speak to are items that we feel like can have an immediate impact. So again, if we can take a look at the next slide, we'll take a look at what some of those are. And these are things that we felt like, as a practical matter, would likely have the best utility in getting through the General Assembly as they're looking at the prospect of putting more investment in infrastructure in North Carolina. And as you can see, there are 3 primary tools that we thought would be worthwhile as they revisited this. One, increase the highway use tax to 5%. For those of you who don't know, the highway use tax is basically a tax that's on the sale of vehicles in North Carolina. Today, North Carolina is at about 3% for a highway use tax. Most of our neighbors are closer to 5%. So this is one of the areas that we saw was ripe for having more investment in North Carolina, but importantly, also having us in a position that we were very consistent with our neighbors. The other component of that we thought was important was eliminating the net of trade exemption. In other words, you're getting a credit, obviously, for trade ends, and you're not getting the full benefit of that money going to the North Carolina Treasury or to the Highway Fund for the benefit of its roads. And the last piece of this that we thought was important was the recapture of proceeds basically from alternative highway use tax, or in other words, if you have a long-term lease or rental of a car, those monies do not go toward highways. They go toward the general fund. So part of what we were trying to do was have some degree of fidelity of use of the roads and where the money is coming from. So again, increasing the highway use tax from 3% to 5%, eliminating the net trade exemption, and recapturing proceeds from the alternative highway use tax were 3 things that we thought were awfully important. Next slide, please. This next slide we recognize is one that frankly is going to be a bit more controversial. And at the same time, we didn't feel like this was something that we needed to shrink away from. Our view was simply this: everyone in the state benefits from our transportation system. Whether you're driving to work, whether you're driving to school, whether you're sending goods to a store or otherwise, the transportation system enables our lives and it enables commerce. One of the views was to increase the sales tax rate by 0.5% to 0.75%. But at the same time, the notion was, if we did that, to lower the gas tax by 9 to 14 cents. Now, we were recognizing that if we were going to increase the sales tax and lower the gas tax in North Carolina, we still had to have something that was going to be positive from a revenue perspective. So again, these numbers put us in the position that we feel like we could. That second bullet on the slide, recapture revenues from transportation-related goods and services, is almost a cousin to the alternative highway use tax. In other words, if we're seeing sales at auto parts stores, transportation services, labor, etc., here's what we'll see: that if we look at those numbers in 2020, that was almost $470 million worth of revenue that could have gone toward transportation in North Carolina, but it was redirected otherwise. So again, we're trying to find very specific areas where we're seeing a nexus to what's going on relative to transportation in our state and tying those funds back to transportation. And lastly, you'll see tax ride-hailing companies, and those 15 other states charge a per-ride fee when you use a ride-hailing company like Uber or Lyft, and our commission thought it was certainly worthy of consideration of applying a sales tax to the gross receipts of those trips. Next slide, please. And we also looked at overall DMV fees. Part of the notion that we thought was so important was the concept of just overall fundamental fairness. And we think that that applies to DMV fees as well. Several things that you'll see on this slide that'll jump off. One, the report finds that electric vehicle owners pay about $50 less, and hybrid vehicle owners pay about $80 less than an average gasoline vehicle owner. Now, some would say at the same time, we're trying to encourage people not to use combustion engines, but whether you're driving a hybrid or whether you're driving an electric vehicle, the wear and tear on the roads is exactly the same. We were also focused on weight because we feel like weight matters. Here's a data point for you. A single 80-pound tractor trailer does the equivalent damage of, wait for it, almost 10,000 vehicles. So again, taking a look at electric vehicles, hybrid, weight on vehicles, and then also looking at road impact fees. Here's something that we've all seen change pretty dramatically during the COVID environment. My guess is whether it's at your office, but most likely at your home, the sheer number of, for example, Amazon vehicles that you see on your street every day has gone up dramatically. At the same time, they're wearing out the roads. We need to find a way to make sure that we're getting some degree of a road impact fee from these vehicles that are disproportionately going up and down our highways, roads, streets, bridges, etc. in North Carolina. The other thing that I think we need to keep in mind is a number of these vehicles will slowly, or maybe in some instances quickly, be transitioning away from gasoline. So to the extent that they're paying for some of that use today, that use is likely to change pretty considerably in the not too distant future. In addition to near-term fees, next slide, please, we looked at things that we thought were options for consideration from a longer-term modernization perspective. And I'll take you through a handful of those on the next slide. And if we can look at slide 10, it'll take you through what we recognize is going to be a serious education effort for North Carolina. And part of what the commission recommended is we need to look at basically a mileage-based user fee, so we can have something that can be in place by the time we get to 2030 that can be a serious substitute for what's happening with the gas tax today. We recognize several things. One, there's a tremendous amount of work that still needs to be done relative to a mileage-based user program. People largely don't understand it. Oftentimes, when they do understand it, they can come to embrace it. If we're looking at the sheer number of states across the United States today that are looking at this, it's nearly 27 states. We have more than half of the states in the United States that are already looking at this, and North Carolina is going to be among them. Here's something that I think we can recognize. Transportation is likely to change more in our world over the next decade than it has over the last 50 years. And if we're not pivoting the way that we pay for highways, bridges, roads, streets, and broader infrastructure indeed, we're not going to be where we need to be. Looking at a mileage-based user program is one of those things. We believe there are ways to do this that can protect people's privacy, and there are ways that we can approach this that can also be fundamentally fair. Here's something that I think most people would not recognize, and that is the studies that we've done on a mileage-based user fee actually tends to reveal that people in rural counties pay less than people in urban counties. And that would go against conventional notions. One of the reasons is they're in rural counties, they're typically driving less fuel efficient vehicles. So again, I think an education process on this is going to be important. The other issues you see on this slide are pretty self-explanatory, and that is, let's take away some of the caps that we see, and these would have to be legislatively addressed on highway tolling and public-private partnerships, as well as reauthorizing and funding a state infrastructure bank. We're also focused on value capture techniques from where roads are being built. Again, as you were listening to the very good presentation that Steve gave just a few minutes ago, you get a good sense of how much value is often created as roads are built. Finding a way to make sure the state of North Carolina is benefiting from that increased value, we believe, is an important part of this conversation as well. But we're even looking more fundamentally at items like truck lanes on interstates like I-95. If we think about I-95 in North Carolina, that's largely about 285 miles. It looks very much the way that it did back in the 1950s, except in certain parts of the state. But at the same time, it's the major north-south corridor up and down the east coast of the United States. If we have truck toll lanes that we can widen that road and make it safer, one, it's revenue for North Carolina. Two, it's safer for North Carolina. Next slide, please. And while we recognize that much of what we're talking about is either a national or a state issue, we also recognize that we have to look at options for local governments as well, because not all government is going to be looking at this in the same fashion. So if we look at some of the options that we outlined for local governments on the next slide, please, you'll see that we came up with a series of options, including authorizing additional local option sales tax for transportation purposes. Again, looking at local road impact fees, local infrastructure banks, and again, the same notion that we had talked about at the state level, and that is looking to authorize value capture techniques where we're seeing more value created from roads as they're built in local communities. As we moved even beyond that, though, we had a few other things that we thought were worthy of consideration as revealed as we go a couple of slides forward. There we are. We think expanding broadband in this state is critically important. We do not see that in the same breadth in parts of the eastern part of the state and the western part of the state as we do in the Triangle, the Triad, and Charlotte-Mecklenburg. So again, expanding broadband, not just for pure infrastructure, but also for job generation, education, et cetera, was something that we thought was important. Something else that we thought was important goes back to that very simple concept that I raised just a moment ago. And that is we're likely to see more evolution and in fact revolution in transportation over the next decade than we have maybe over the last 50 years. Having someone in Raleigh, someone in the Department of Transportation who views their role as the Chief Innovation Officer, we think is awfully important. And lastly, taking a look too at increasing debt capacity. Again, as we look at where North Carolina sits today from a fiscal perspective, the state's in a very good place. Interest rates are historically low. I mean, if you spend any time listening to Jay Powell at the Fed, you'll get a sense that they're likely to be that way for a while. At the same time, this is something that we believe we need to look at, study, consider, but then importantly, we need to act on as well. We've laid out a number of actions here that we think are important, but part of what the state of North Carolina is in fact going to have to do at the end of the day is do something, because maintaining the status quo is not going to have us where we need to be in the next 10 years and certainly beyond that. But one of the things that you can do, and looking at the next slide, is you can take a look at the Creating Revenue and Finding Transportation Solutions, or CRAFTS tool. You can see it on the NC First Commission website. And what this allows you to do is do a series of what ifs. And you can back into what needs would be, how they can be funded, and using different levers, what it would look like if you pulled on those different levers. At the end of our analysis, one of the most important things that we thought that we could do is, number one, do presentations just like this today, because we recognize education on this issue is important. We also recognize that talking about transportation isn't always the most riveting thing in the world for people to listen to. But we do recognize that for our lives, there are very few things that will impact our lives for good or for bad that can be more impactful than the way that we approach infrastructure and transportation across the state of North Carolina. So with that, Joe, I think we're going to transition over, and I think you're likely to hear either from Amna or Emeline with respect to how the public thinks about some of these different funding options into the future. So Joe, back to you, and then over to who's next.
Sounds perfect. Ward, thank you for the remarks. And frankly, everybody got a treat today getting what I think is a pretty darn good overview of what that work of the commission that you described for many, many months, diving into this with some specific tangible recommendations. So Ward, thank you for your time today and your leadership on that, not just the past 2 years, but going forward with this. So very much appreciate that. Yep. And just as you said, we're going to transition right over to Amna. You're going to take it away there, and you can introduce Emeline after that. So Amna, go ahead.
Thank you, Joe. It was a pleasure to work with Mr. Nye and Mayor McFarland. They were the right people for the job. So the NC First Commission conducted a series of surveys as part of its work to try to gauge public support for various revenue proposals that they were considering. And as you know, public support is often key to seek any type of legislative change. And so these studies indicate that there are both challenges and opportunities concerning public perceptions about the status of the condition of the highway system, the need for additional investment, and attitudes about who should pay and how much. One function of my job is to help educate the public about the need for a diversified and a sustainable funding system. And the survey results really are a valuable tool in understanding where there are knowledge gaps, but also to combat misinformation and myths. So by conducting these multiple surveys, NCDOT now has a better understanding of what the public supports, such as a user fee concept, and what the public does not support, like a additional tax on electricity or property taxes. We know that there is a lot of concern about one of the, I think, leading options around the country, and that's the miles-based user fee. They're concerned about the financial impact for rural residents, low-income residents, and privacy concerns, for example. But we've also learned from this work that public acceptance increases when we can provide more information and clarify some of those misconceptions. The survey results indicate that residents consider the transportation network to be one of the most important public policy issues facing the country. And we've learned that there are regional differences around North Carolina, where you have Eastern and Western residents ranking transportation as being more important than those people living in the central areas of the state. But most importantly, perhaps, we've learned that there is just more need for baseline education to achieve public acceptance. And I think the work of the NC Chamber that was displayed, the NC First Commission, and they have both helped lessen that knowledge gap. But we still have a ways to go to explain why investments are so costly and the extent to which NCDOT's current funding level is inadequate. So the public does need additional assurance that funds are being spent efficiently, and we need to demonstrate how alternative revenues can produce a system that is fair and competitive. The survey results should, hopefully will help our transportation advocates to tailor their messages to show concretely the benefits of additional investments. They need to understand that these additional investments really affect their daily life and how they will individually benefit from these enhancements. So I'm turning it over for a review of one of the ITRE survey results. We know that this is all about how to achieve a quality of life. And now it's just really a matter of connecting the dots.
Great, thank you so much for introducing me. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Can y'all see my presentation all right?
See and hear, good to go.
Okay, perfect. So I'll go ahead and dive in. I'm going to be talking with you all today about the public perceptions of transportation fees and taxes in North Carolina. So there are pressures and challenges to the long-term sustainability of transportation revenue streams, such as changes in how vehicles are powered, and this influenced the questions that we asked on this survey. The study is a follow-up to a 2019 study that has been refined to better understand how the public perceives transportation taxes and fees. Overall, we've again found that public perceptions of transportation taxes and fees vary by demographic, but in most cases, not too drastically. Many states are exploring alternative funding mechanisms and have been making some of the same changes that North Carolina has made in recent years, as well as additional changes. Overall, we found that support exists for maintaining and increasing road funding. There is a preference for the gas tax, but support exists to diversify funding sources. The survey had a sample size of 1,049 individuals from locations across the state. It was deployed in July and August of 2020. The survey was conducted by Ipsos using a probability-based web panel that is designed to be representative of the population of the United States. Weights were applied afterwards to generate estimates to represent the state population accurately. We asked respondents to estimate the current state gas tax rate per gallon. The correct answer is 36.1 cents per gallon for everyone's reference. The respondents were split between 3 ballots. Ballot A was multiple choice with the options listed on the graph. Ballot B was open form, but asked respondents to enter their estimate in cents only. Ballot C was open form and allowed respondents to enter both dollars and cents. Overall, around 30% of respondents responded with the correct answer. However, this is highly impacted by the way the question was worded, which we expected. So we chose the split ballot approach to explore these potential impacts. This likely supports the idea that a minority of people know the correct answer and that they're swayed by the question wording itself. In the previous study, just under 30% of respondents estimated correctly. When presented with the cents only option, even though they could use 100 cents or more to equal $1 or more, the respondents underestimated the actual rate with approximately 50% of responses in the lowest category, which you can see over here, this yellow bar. Respondents with the dollar and cents open form question estimated the tax rate to be 90 cents or more at a much higher rate than any other group of respondents. And you can see that over here, this gray bar. We also asked respondents how confident they were about their answer, and the majority of respondents said they simply guessed. Also counterintuitively, the least confident respondents were the most likely to respond correctly, and the most confident respondents were the most likely to respond incorrectly. It's not exactly surprising that people don't know the cost of the gas tax. It's typically a very minor portion of the expense of owning and operating a vehicle. It trails in comparison to depreciation, fuel, insurance, maintenance, tires, financing, all those things. When we asked where new spending is most needed if the state of North Carolina increased its spending on transportation, we found that half of respondents support maintaining and building highways as their preferred option. The next two categories are relatively equal in preference, and those are multimodal service and improving safety. And then last, coming in under 10%, we have modernizing transportation technologies. When we examine the same question, comparing urban and rural respondents, their opinions were proportionally similar. The number one choice is still maintaining and building highways. However, highway priorities by rural residents exceeded those of urban residents. Urban respondents place more emphasis on multimodal service, safety, and transportation technologies. And when we examine the same question by education level, respondents with higher levels of education prefer multimodal services and modernizing transportation technologies than those that have a lower education level. And then here, when we examine the same question by age group, we can see that younger age groups have more diverse responses with higher percentages of support for multimodal, safety, and transportation technologies, whereas we see support for maintaining and building highways generally increases with age. The plurality of respondents supported an increase in funding, while many also supported no change, which we think this category has grown from previous years, possibly as a result of uncertainty around the pandemic. We also asked respondents how satisfied they are with NCDOT services, and 73% of respondents report that they are satisfied with NCDOT services. And these results are consistent with results from transportation-related ballots across the United States. In 2016, 70% of transportation measures passed, and in 2020, 80% of transportation measures passed. And then again, this is that same question, comparing urban and rural respondents. More urban residents think that there should be a decrease in funding, although the amount remains under 10% of respondents. And then again, the same question, comparing education level. As the education level increases, fewer think that there should be a decrease in funding, and more think that there should be no change in funding. And then this is the same question comparing the age groups. The most support for funding increases are within the 18 to 24, the 55 to 64, and the 65 to 74 age groups. We have a pretty steep drop off in the 75 plus age group. So next we asked where road funding should come from, and respondents had a slight preference for usage-based fees. The amount favoring usage-based fees had an increase from the previous survey in 2019. We also followed up asking respondents if they would support or oppose increasing taxes on residential electricity usage if the new revenue was devoted to meeting the state's transportation needs. And the vast majority, about 85%, opposed this proposed tax, and the majority of those opposed it strongly. We also asked respondents if they would support or oppose the state adding a vehicle weight fee to account for the extra damage heavy vehicles cause, and they were told that this would exclude vehicles for personal use. 62% of respondents supported this and 38% opposed. So next we asked which of the following options that they would prefer the North Carolina rely on: the sales tax, the gas tax, or wage-based user fee. Again, we used the split ballot approach here with varying levels of information. So in ballot A, we didn't give any specific numbers. We just asked if they would prefer an increase in the tax on gasoline purchases, an increase in the general state sales tax, or a new fee on miles driven. On ballot B, we added numbers in, and we asked if they would prefer an increase of 9 cents per gallon in the tax on gasoline purchases, a new half of 1 cent fee for each mile driven, or an increase of half of 1 cent per dollar in the general state sales tax. In ballot C, we increased those numbers, and we asked if they would prefer an increase of 18 cents per gallon in the tax on gasoline purchases, a new 1 cent fee for each mile driven, or an increase of 1 cent per dollar in the general state sales tax. The general question in ballot A without the specific amounts resulted in the highest support for the gas tax, but when amounts were provided that would generate the same amount of revenue for transportation, people preferred the sales tax. On ballot B, where we mentioned a 9 cent per gallon increase, the sales tax seemed to pull in some of the gas tax proponents. In ballot C, with an 18 cent per gallon increase and a 1 cent mileage-based user fee, the sales tax seemed to pull in some of the mileage-based user fee supporters. And like I mentioned earlier, although 57% of respondents had indicated that they would prefer a usage-based fee, the general state sales tax is one of the more prevalent choices for respondents. As a follow-up to that question, we asked respondents kind of what made them choose the mileage-based user fee, the gas tax, or the sales tax. So fairness was the top concern for both groups of respondents. 71% of respondents who selected the mileage-based user fee said fairness was their reason for choosing it, while logistics and privacy concerns played a larger role for those choosing the gas or sales tax. Privacy concerns were much lower in the previous survey when they were asked the same question. Almost half of respondents support hybrid and electric vehicle drivers paying less, especially those who own hybrid and electric vehicles, unsurprisingly. In the 2019 survey, 38% supported hybrid vehicle drivers paying less, so this increased in 2020. Again, we used a split ballot approach. In ballot A, respondents were told that hybrid vehicle drivers are typically more fuel efficient than gas-powered vehicles, and that for this reason, drivers of a hybrid vehicle pay lower taxes for their use of the roadway because they travel further per each gallon of gas purchased. Respondents were given that information, and they were also told that drivers of electric vehicles do not pay any gas tax. However, they pay $130 a year for their use of the roads. There was less support when respondents were told the additional information about the electric vehicles. When we examined a driver's vehicle type, we found that drivers of hybrid and electric vehicles had higher levels of support for the gas tax than drivers of gas and diesel-powered vehicles. This could be because they want to save themselves the money, or maybe they're interested in the gas tax as a de facto carbon tax. And then compared to 2019, more respondents found the gas tax either fair or inexpensive. 41% of respondents thought that the gas tax was too expensive in 2019. So the expensive category has definitely decreased substantially. Again, here we used a split ballot approach. In ballot A, we proposed, or we asked about an annual fee, and in ballot B, we asked about a monthly fee. And then just kind of to sum everything up, respondents generally support an increase in funding. They also do not know the current gas tax rate, even if they claim to be confident in their response. They believe that $200 a year in state gas tax is a fair amount of money. They are overall satisfied with NCDOT services. And while they prefer a usage-based tax in theory, when you specifically ask them, sales tax is, the preference for a sales tax is prevalent. And in that same vein, the numbers matter when you're asking if respondents prefer a mileage-based user fee, a state sales tax, or a gas tax. And also equivalency is key. What amount of gas tax is equivalent to a mileage-based user fee? And then lastly, the subtle differences in opinions about transportation issues across subgroups are there. They're typically pretty proportional, but they are there. The differences between urban and rural groups, education level, and age group. And that's all I had for y'all today. Thank you for having me. And I enjoyed everyone else's presentation very much as well.
Well, we certainly enjoyed your presentation. That was fantastic. And also Amna's remarks as well, Emeline. So that was great. And you touched into really one of the basic questions we have from almost any public policy debate, even beyond transportation, where folks favor other people paying as opposed to themselves. And so that's going to be an ongoing challenge. I remember years ago when we were looking at toll roads for the first time in our region, if I remember right, a poll came out and they said that only 7% of the people were supporting a toll to accelerate one of our freeways in the Research Triangle area. And I was shocked at who these 7% were. It should have been 0% given the choice of other people paying or people paying themselves. It should have been 0. So I was surprised for that 7%. So it's always a challenge. But if everyone will put their cameras back on that are our speakers, you all did fantastic. And we do have some sample questions that have come in. And so I'm going to go ahead and just go right through those in just a moment. And before we do it though, let's give a verbal round of applause to all of our speakers. So even if you can't have your camera on, then you can do that. So they did a good job. My first question is going to be for Ward. And so actually, so others should turn their camera, not their camera, should mute themselves other than Ward so we don't get that feedback. So Ward, if you could make 3 or even just 1 change to the existing revenue structure for transportation. Any thoughts on that? If you're just going to pick even just 1, what would you?
Yeah, I see Amna Cameron looking right at me.
That's where this came from.
No. You know, the fact is we have to have something that's going to be durable, something that's collectible, and something that works. And in my sense is, in the fullness of time, a sales tax, an MBUF, a mileage-based user fee, and varying degrees of more direct user fees will likely be the way to attack that. I'll confess I took way too much Latin when I was in high school. It's never done me much good, but I remember the commentary, Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War started with Gallus. The whole was divided into 3 parts. And the fact is, I think we're going to have funding basically divided into probably at least 3 parts. And I think the sales tax is so efficient and it's so immediate but it's going to be attacked by many as being regressive. You know, the gas tax is going to suffer the same thing, but in the fullness of time, having something that can go after the miles, because that's what's putting the wear and tear on the roads is going to be important. And then I think the targeted fees relative to weight and to use on some of these third parties will likely be the important ways, at least in my view, to look at that.
Okay. And I would just for all the entire audience, the wisdom in what Ward said about it's not going to be just one source, it's going to be three. Pay attention to that when this game is all done. You'll remember this conversation here. Ward, I appreciate exactly what you said and the way you did that. There's not going to be one silver bullet. If we had it, I think that has showed up a while ago. So that's very good.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Question for Emeline. Great presentation, great survey results, informative. If you were going to look at this nationally versus our own folks, what's the biggest difference you saw? Are we that much different in this wonderful, beautiful purple state? Or are we remarkably similar to how others feel about transportation funding and revenue?
I think the results are pretty consistent across the United States as far as how people feel about transportation funding. People generally want transportation to have more funding, but they don't want to pay for that funding. So I think that's pretty consistent in other surveys I've seen across the United States.
Okay, that's probably not surprising. And no, not even at some of the nuances that you saw and some of the specifics, still pretty similar across the countries versus here.
Yeah, I mean, here we do see some more concerns, both in the survey and just in discussion about the impacts on rural drivers over urban drivers. So that's kind of an issue that gets brought up. And like I showed in the presentation, there are some questions and topics where you do see some differing opinions between urban and rural drivers.
Okay, that's very good. I had one for Kelly, and it's more of a broader one. Not even really totally transportation related other than in passing. Less about solving the problem, but from what you see from your work leading the Chamber Foundation and how this fits with all of the other issues that you're dealing with to fulfill the vision of the State Chamber's work and Vision 2030, has this risen in the past year or two? Has it fallen? Has it been largely steady in terms of resonance and saliency? Where is this right now, do you think?
That's a great question. I would say it's risen. I'm sure in no small part to the fact that our chairman is Ward Nye and our vice chairman is Seppi Saidi. But I believe it's much bigger than that. And I believe that people are seeing the growth. We have couple big buckets that I see. In our urban areas, we've got crazy growth. And in parts of our state, we have seen, like, I think the third highest increase in number of miles traveled between 2020 and 2019, if I get that data about right. And yet our rural communities that Ward's talking about have some of the poorest condition roads, certainly in our state. So I believe that there is real attention being paid on both sides of that from the business community. And Seppi would say, and this is, you know, as I said in my opening comments, she believes, and I too, that a solid infrastructure system, especially transportation, is literally the foundation of economic development. And from there, everything builds. So I would say that the business community has seen this rise in their understanding and in their emphasis on the importance of having this, the funding model altered and then also increased towards point earlier.
Okay, that makes sense to me. And it's interesting, you mentioned the pieces about some of our rural areas. Emeline mentioned that just a few moments ago. Ward talking about 1, 2, 3 options. It's not just going to be one thing. And it's pretty clear to me just hearing you all speak and listening to your remarks that whatever that solution is for our state, we've got to make sure we're applying a metropolitan fabric or lens and a rural fabric, or we're not going to get it passed, and it's got to make sense for both somehow. As speaking of essentially equity considerations, Steve, you did a nice job describing some of the various projects you go through in terms of economic assumptions. And of course, a lot of what we're talking about today is making sure there's enough revenue to build highway projects. But there are times, and you noted that, where there's some skepticism about some of these projects and some negative externalities, as you call them. How do you take those into consideration? How do the department broadly, how do they take it into consideration when they're planning? What's their, and I know it's hard to summarize that, but even just in a sentence or two, what's your quick thinking on that?
Yeah, sure, Joe, that's a great question. I think, you know, one of the examples that I gave was from, it really started in the 1960s. So I think we've come really a long way in the type of infrastructure projects that we do fund. But you know, with that being stated, we have a lot more access to granular data, geospatial data, to see how not only how there may be benefits at the end point of a project through connectivity, but also maybe some of the social costs that may occur throughout the project area. So how do we take those into consideration? That's something that we're continuing to get better with all the time. There are methodologies available in Australia and New Zealand, and they're starting to find their way to the United States. You know, I don't have the perfect answer just yet, but I think transportation planners everywhere are grappling with this question. And right now, for the upcoming transportation authorization bill, the administration is looking to spend about $20 billion to deal with neighborhood severance, some of the other costs associated with some of those older landmark projects that have left some societal issues. So I think we've taken what we've learned in the past, are applying it to the present, and using a lot better granular data to deal with that.
Yeah, well, it's good to see progress in any sort of modeling, research, and ultimately improvement for the state and the country and the profession. So those are good remarks there. I had a quick question for Amna. It's something that you mentioned when you were describing working on the first commission and so on. And you mentioned that the chairs of that commission, one of which is with us here, were the right people for the job. And we all agree with you. Give me something from your perspective that came out of that commission, even if it wasn't a finding, even the process or the camaraderie, the focus that just struck you in your role as a legislative leader. Give me something that occurred to you, say, about the way this process is going that might have brought a smile to your face as someone who's serving all of us in the legislature.
The commissioners were so engaged. What surprised me is early on, these are our business, industry, government leaders coming on, and the amount of time that they devoted. It wasn't just the commission; it was so much time spent behind the public's eyes. We had separate work groups going on in the background. Both co-chairs had several independent meetings with every single commissioner. And so there is an incredible camaraderie and openness that we were very fortunate at DOT that this unique group of individuals so easily coalesced together and were fully dedicated for the entire nearly 2 years.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. A number of folks that we know served on that commission. And we want to thank you for your work on that commission too, for helping everybody through that. I mean, that's senior staff support's essential. Otherwise, these things don't happen. So we applaud you for your leadership. And I want to applaud all of these speakers today, Ward and Amna, Steve, Kelly, and Emeline. You all were fantastic in terms of not just your remarks today, but your preparation for today. You saw that in the words they used, you saw that in the slides and the thoughtfulness that they did. And just as Amna said about the commission, a lot of camaraderie with this group was exhibited today. And I got to tell you straight up, we're going to need a lot more camaraderie and a lot more focus, because this stuff just isn't that easy to get solved. I wish it was, but if it was, we wouldn't be having these talking things. I'm comfortable that we're going to get the solution, but I'm an optimistic guy, and that's the way the RTA is. So we're at 4:59. Our job is to end on time. This session is being recorded. I'm sure the recording on our devices will be coffee table keepsakes for generations to come as we go back and think about this. But I think just it's been a wonderful time. Again, please, on your own, applaud folks on that. Thank you for those who texted me even individually throughout the session here. I think I agree with you. This is a fantastic session. We appreciate all your things. And Shreyas, who is helping for the technical side, thank you for your leadership through this. Anything else any final closing remarks we should offer to our group before we adjourn here? Anything else? Okay, board up.
Thank you, Joe.
Oh, you're welcome. My honor to do so. My honor to do so. So as we say in RTA, let's get moving. And as we say at Southern District, we are adjourned. So have a great afternoon.